Ivanka Trump came to a congressional hearing ready to tear Jasmine Crockett apart. What she didn't know was that Jasmine had kept a voicemail that would not only stop her in her tracks, but change how the entire room saw her. The room wasn't massive, but it was packed tight. Every chair filled, every corner lined with aides, staffers, and a few reporters lucky enough to get inside. The ethics review hearing was meant to be quiet, procedural. No press cameras, no prepared speeches, just a long table, a row of panelists, and the low murmur of government at work behind closed doors. Washington, D.C. was its usual July self, humid, impatient, and coiled tight with political tension. Inside this room, though, the temperature felt colder. People weren't here to argue policies. They were here to assess character. Representative Jasmine Crockett sat at the far end of the long oak table, calm, poised, her notes neatly stacked in front of her. She wore a gray suit, not flashy, not loud, but sharp. Her expression was unreadable, her fingers loosely intertwined as she waited for her turn to speak. The day had already dragged past schedule. A few minor ethics disputes had been reviewed and shelved. Then the chair, Representative Glenn Norwood from Ohio, tapped the mic and cleared his throat. All right, we'll be moving to the next review item. We've received a submission from a third-party participant requesting the opportunity to speak. This individual is not a current member of Congress, but was deemed relevant by committee vote. There was a collective shifting in seats. Third-party submissions were rare. Rarer still when the name Ivanka Trump followed. Glenn looked up. Ivanka Trump, you may address the panel. She stood from the back, heels clicking with practiced elegance, and made her way to the podium with that carefully constructed composure she'd mastered over years in the spotlight. Her beige blouse and black pencil skirt were perfectly fitted, not a hair out of place. Phones in the room weren't allowed to record, but you could still feel the silent clicking, every blink capturing the moment in memory. Jasmine didn't move. She kept her eyes on the edge of the table, jaw relaxed. But everyone could feel it. Something was coming. Ivanka adjusted the microphone and smiled faintly. Good afternoon. Thank you for the opportunity to speak. Polite, polished, familiar. I want to begin by acknowledging the importance of ethical integrity in public service. It's not partisan, it's foundational. There were a few small nods around the table. And with that in mind, she continued, her tone dipping just slightly, I feel it's necessary to express my concern regarding Representative Jasmine Crockett. The air shifted. Ivanka looked straight ahead, never at Jasmine, as she delivered the next line. I believe her recent conduct reflects a pattern of reckless behavior, performative aggression, and language unbecoming of someone in her position. While public service demands passion, it also demands restraint. And frankly, I do not believe Representative Crockett demonstrates the kind of measured leadership we should require from this body. A few members shifted again, this time uncomfortably. One or two exchanged glances. Jasmine stayed still. Ivanka pressed on. She has, in recent months, made inflammatory comments, used social media to escalate political tensions, and repeatedly undermined bipartisan progress by refusing to engage respectfully with opposition members. This isn't about party lines. It's about fitness. A faint cough came from the left side of the room. One Republican panelist, Representative Caleb Dwyer of Idaho, pressed his lips together, looking suddenly interested. The entire room had changed in 5 minutes. What had begun as a routine ethics review had become a slow, public reckoning. But Jasmine still hadn't moved. No flinch, no rebuttal, just stillness, calm, like stone. Ivanka's voice softened as she wrapped up. I respect the difficult work that happens in this room, but I urge the panel to consider whether behavior like this damages public trust in ways we cannot afford. With that, she stepped back, thanked the committee again, and returned to her seat at the rear. All eyes moved to Jasmine. Her name hadn't been officially listed for questioning today. Her team had received no notice that Ivanka would appear, no chance to prepare. And yet, her eyes finally lifted, steady and clear. There was no flash of anger, no raised brow. Just a small breath, a soft click as she opened her binder, and a quiet voice that cut through the tension like a scalpel. Chairman Norwood, if I may respond. But no one expected what she was about to do next. The room didn't breathe. Chairman Norwood gave a single short nod, his face unreadable. He leaned back in his chair, and for a few seconds, nobody moved. Not even the stenographer. Jasmine Crockett stood slowly, deliberately. Her heels barely made a sound on the linoleum as she approached the same podium Ivanka had left seconds ago. She didn't shuffle papers or clear her throat. She looked straight ahead, not at Ivanka, not at anyone else. Just out into the room, like she knew exactly where this was going. "I didn't come here to speak today," she began. "But I also didn't come here to be lied about." A murmur moved through the crowd, hushed and nervous. She let the words land and sink, her voice calm, not defensive. "I've sat in this seat for nearly 3 hours. I've listened to discussion after discussion about accountability, transparency, truth, and now, suddenly, without warning, I'm being accused of being unfit for office by someone who doesn't even serve in this chamber." A couple of heads turned toward Ivanka, who was now sitting completely still, hands clasped in her lap. Jasmine paused for a breath, her fingers resting lightly on the podium. Her tone shifted, firmer now, grounded. "Let's be real. This ain't about ethics. This is about image, narrative, control. I know the pattern when I see it. A black woman who speaks with passion, who calls things what they are, suddenly becomes aggressive or unfit. That's an old trick in a new dress." Chairman Norwood raised an eyebrow, but said nothing. "I've disagreed with colleagues on both sides of the aisle. I've raised my voice. I've said things that made people uncomfortable. That doesn't make me reckless. It makes me honest." There it was. That voice the public had come to know. The one that didn't need to yell to be heard. "But since we're talking about fitness," she continued, slowly reaching into her blazer pocket, "I'd like to offer some clarity." She pulled out a small device, an old iPhone, cracked along one edge, and held it up. "This phone contains a voicemail I received 2 months ago. It's from a trusted mutual contact, someone both Ms. Trump and I know personally. In it, she left a message, unfiltered, unrehearsed." She turned slightly, addressing the committee again. "I ask that the panel allow me to play this audio. It's under 45 seconds. Afterward, I'll say my piece, and I'll sit down." The room seemed unsure. Playing a personal recording in an ethics hearing wasn't protocol, but it wasn't forbidden either. Chairman Norwood glanced toward legal counsel seated just behind him. The woman leaned forward and whispered something inaudible. He hesitated, then nodded once. "You may proceed," he said. Jasmine tapped the phone a few times, then handed it to the tech seated at the side of the room. He plugged it into the audio system, adjusted the volume. A quiet pop. Then came the voice. "I know she makes people nervous, but Jasmine's the real deal. She's one of the only ones up there actually fighting for people. And I mean people, not headlines, not donors. She's fierce. I wish more were like her." It was unmistakably Ivanka. Warm, admitting respect, even admiration. No one said a word. The recording ended. The silence that followed was louder than anything yet spoken. Some shifted uncomfortably, but no one looked Ivanka's way this time. Jasmine didn't smile. She didn't gloat. She returned to the podium like it was any other day. "That message wasn't meant for me. It was meant for someone else. But they shared it because they knew this moment would come." Her voice dipped just slightly. "It always comes. When the truth doesn't serve the script, people rewrite the story." Ivanka hadn't moved. Her posture stayed intact, her expression neutral, but her eyes had lost the shine. Jasmine continued, "You don't have to like my tone. You don't have to like how I vote, how I speak, or how I show up. But you do have to respect that I show up, that I work, that I fight for my district, that I don't fold when someone throws dirt just to see if it sticks." Now the tension was shifting again, away from accusation and towards something more uncertain, more thoughtful. "I'm not here to clap back or perform. I'm here to remind this room that truth still matters, even when it's inconvenient." She turned back to Chairman Norwood. "I yield." And with that, she stepped away from the mic. But the room wasn't ready to move on. Not yet. For a moment, there was no sound. No shifting papers, no clearing throats, not even the usual tapping from nervous staffers with pens. Just quiet. A tight, unfamiliar kind that stretched across every face in the room. Chairman Norwood didn't say anything. He just stared ahead, his knuckles resting on the table. Beside him, a younger aide leaned in to whisper, but Norwood didn't move. Then it started. Not loud, not dramatic, just small movements. People looking at one another, trying to read the mood before they opened their mouths. Representative Caleb Dwyer leaned slightly toward Representative Gerald Wexley across the table. Gerald blinked slowly, then tilted his head like he wasn't sure what he'd just witnessed. It wasn't just the audio. It was who had played it. Jasmine hadn't raised her voice once. She hadn't insulted anyone. She hadn't even called Ivanka out directly. And yet, it hit harder than any speech they'd heard in months. At the back of the room, a staffer scribbled something quickly in a notebook. Two others exchanged glances, one of them mouthing a quiet, "Wow," before turning his attention back to the table. Ivanka sat still, but the color in her face had changed. Not red with embarrassment, just pale, like someone watching the version of herself she wanted to project slowly erode in real time. Chairman Norwood finally spoke, voice low. Representative Crockett's response has been noted for the record. The panel will resume the scheduled review. But it was clear, no one wanted to go back to routine. The air had shifted, and Jasmine had returned to her seat like nothing had happened. A few chairs down, Representative Sheila Ransom from Oregon leaned slightly toward her. "That was cold-blooded," she whispered, eyes wide. Jasmine didn't smile. "Just facts," she said softly. Caleb Dwyer cleared his throat, trying to break the fog. "I'd like to revisit an item from earlier," he said, fumbling with his notes. No one was listening. Even the stenographer glanced up, unsure if she should continue typing or just take a break. The atmosphere had cracked, and from that crack, something new was leaking in. Discomfort, reflection, maybe even regret. People weren't sure where they stood anymore. A Republican strategist, seated quietly near the wall, scribbled 3 words onto a legal pad. Not the moment. He knew what this was supposed to be, a performance, a jab at the progressive wing, an easy win for the optics game. But now, it was starting to feel like a backfire. On Jasmine's end, her phone buzzed silently in her jacket. A staffer across the room gave her a tiny nod. Text messages were already pouring in. The leak hadn't happened yet, but people talk. And when people talk in D.C., the rest of the world hears it fast. Meanwhile, one of the younger panelists, Representative Colleen Bay from Minnesota, sat completely still, her hands clenched together on her lap. She had been one of those who often criticized Jasmine's approach, calling her too abrasive for coalition building. But something in the way Jasmine had handled herself today unsettled that belief. Colleen wasn't ready to say it out loud yet, but she was reconsidering her stance, and that mattered. Because behind every closed-door review, behind every procedural step, behind every smoothed-over phrase in a press release, was perception. And perception was changing. Even Norwood, stoic, slow-moving Norwood, tapped his pen once, then twice, before adjusting his glasses and looking toward Jasmine for a second longer than necessary. "Moving forward," he said, "the committee will review item 8B. A few attendees shifted again, this time trying to fall back into rhythm. But there was no rhythm left. The mood was cracked wide open, and at the center of it all sat Jasmine, silent, still, unreadable, but more powerful than she'd ever looked. But the moment wasn't over yet, not even close. The formal agenda resumed, but only on paper. As Norwood read aloud the next item, barely anyone processed it. Eyes kept drifting toward Jasmine. A few watched Ivanka, but she was stiff now, almost hidden behind the polite mask she'd worn walking in. Something was different in the room. People weren't here to just hear anymore. They were watching, calculating, remembering. Jasmine, however, didn't seem to care. She leaned toward her aide, Amani, a sharp and fast-moving woman from Fort Worth, and whispered, "Pull the timeline file." Amani raised an eyebrow. "You want to go ahead with it?" Jasmine nodded, quiet but certain. "They need to hear all of it." Amani tapped her iPad, scrolled, then passed it to Jasmine with a look that said, "You sure?" Jasmine gave a tiny shrug. "Excuse me, Chairman," she said calmly. "Since my name was brought up in an official capacity, I'd like to use my remaining time to provide context." Norwood looked up, expression unreadable. After a pause, he gestured with his hand. "Proceed." Jasmine stood again, holding the tablet in one hand and a printed sheet in the other. She didn't return to the podium. Instead, she spoke directly from her seat. The voice was the same, measured, focused, but it carried more weight now. "I want to walk this room through the actual work I've done over the last 14 months, she began. No sound bites, just facts. She raised the paper and began to read. "In March, I introduced the Urban Policing Reform Act, tied to data from communities across Ohio, Arizona, and Louisiana. Bipartisan support. 3 Republican co-sponsors. It passed subcommittee review unanimously." She paused. "In May, I worked with Representative Gabriel Chen from Utah on a rural education equity package. The goal? Internet access in underserved school districts, not just in Texas, in places some of y'all haven't stepped foot in since campaign season. There was a faint exhale from someone at the end of the table. She didn't break stride. In July, I helped establish the Clean Access Corridor Plan. That bill focused on lead pipe removal across state lines using federal grants without partisan restrictions. That one passed the House floor with votes from both sides. Check the record. She looked up now. Her eyes didn't wander. She met faces, one by one. You can disagree with how I speak. You can be uncomfortable with how direct I am. But when you measure work, real work, you don't get to ignore the numbers. Someone near the back, Representative William Hurst, shifted in his chair. He'd once accused Jasmine of being all style, no substance, in an offhand remark to a reporter. Today, he hadn't said a word. Jasmine continued, "In my district, there are zip codes with less access to medical services than rural parts of South Dakota. I've spent the last year building coalitions with people I've never voted with. Not because I had to, but because my people needed it." She let that linger. This isn't about image. It's about impact. A silence followed that line, deeper than the ones before. Ivanka had looked down now. Her hands, once folded neatly, were resting apart on her lap. Her eyes weren't on Jasmine anymore. One of the aides by the door scribbled something in a notebook. Jasmine glanced at him, then back to the room. "I didn't bring this up today. I didn't ask to be defended or explained. But since someone thought my name needed to be dragged into this, then let's drag the facts with it." There was a weight to her voice now. Not just defiance, but something deeper. Weariness? Maybe. But more than that, control. She turned back toward Norwood, this time lowering the papers. "That's all I've got." She didn't wait for applause or reaction. She didn't need it. She sat back down, slid the tablet to Amani, and took a long, quiet sip from her water bottle like it was any other Tuesday. But it wasn't. The panel had just watched her dismantle an entire accusation with nothing but a list of receipts. But it was what happened after the hearing that would change everything. The session broke for a 10-minute recess, but nobody moved. Not right away. One by one, chairs squeaked back from the table and people filed out. Some whispered to their aides, others walked out in silence, deep in thought. The usual hum of a break was replaced by something else, an awkward quiet, like the kind that hangs around after someone said what nobody else had the guts to. Jasmine didn't stand. She stayed seated, eyes focused on her binder, flipping a page she had no intention of reading. Amani leaned over and whispered, "You sure you want to hang back? You know the reporters are circling the hallway." Jasmine shook her head. "Let them circle. We didn't leak the recording. We played it in this room, where it mattered." Outside, the panelists trickled down the hallway. Some peeled off toward restrooms. Others paced or took calls. Ivanka walked in the opposite direction from the others, phone clutched tightly in her hand, lips pressed thin. No eye contact. No glances toward the press. But by the time she made it to the end of the corridor, it was already too late. The audio was out. It wasn't clear how. Maybe someone in the room recorded it against the rules. Maybe the mutual acquaintance who originally shared the voicemail with Jasmine decided it was time to go public. Maybe an aide texted it to the wrong number. It didn't matter. By the time Ivanka reached the side exit, the 45-second clip was circulating on 3 different news blogs and had been reposted on X by a popular political strategist with the caption, "This you, Ivanka?" Reporters swarmed near the sidewalk, but security held them off. Still, their questions cut through the air like knives. "Ms. Trump, did you send that voicemail? Why praise Crockett privately and criticize her publicly? Did the RNC approve your appearance today?" No answers. Just the rhythmic sound of Ivanka's heels hitting the pavement a little too fast. Inside, Jasmine finally rose from her seat, gathered her things, and calmly walked toward the side hallway. Amani was close behind. "Looks like it's out," Amani said, holding up her phone screen. Jasmine took a glance. That was all she said, but her posture was lighter now. Shoulders not so tight, jaw relaxed. The kind of body language that comes from knowing you didn't have to throw a punch to win a fight. They turned a corner into a private hallway heading toward her car. That's when she spotted him. Representative Arthur Weissman, the oldest member of the committee. A Reagan-era conservative who rarely engaged unless absolutely necessary. He stood by a vending machine, slowly pulling a bottle of water from the rack. He saw her, paused, then walked toward her with careful steps. "Representative Crockett," he said, voice low. She stopped. Amani's grip on her phone tightened. I won't pretend we've ever agreed, Weissman said, straightening his tie. And I've certainly said things in the past I wouldn't repeat today. Jasmine didn't speak. She just waited. But I'll tell you something, he went on. I've sat through more hearings than I can count. And today, that was the first time in a long time I saw someone handle a blindside without blinking. Jasmine's eyes narrowed slightly. You saying that for yourself or for the record? Weissman gave a half smile. Both. He turned and walked away without another word. Amani gave Jasmine a look. That was weird. Yeah, Jasmine said, half smiling now. But I'll take it. By the time they reached the black SUV parked out back, the clip had already made it to primetime political Twitter. Someone paired it with a split screen of Ivanka's live statement from the hearing and the audio clip from her voicemail. It was brutal. The contrast couldn't have been clearer. Inside the vehicle, Jasmine sank into the seat. Amani handed her a charger and opened a tablet, scanning the flood of commentary. She's trending, Amani muttered. Even folks who don't like you are saying you handled it with class. Jasmine didn't look up. She stared out the window as the SUV pulled into traffic. I wasn't trying to trend, she said. I was trying to survive the day with my dignity. Amani grinned. Well, you did that, and then some. But the clip wasn't just trending. It was about to start a conversation that neither side could control. 2 months earlier, Jasmine had been standing in the back lot of a community center in Tulsa, Oklahoma, sweat collecting at her temples in the early evening heat. The town hall had just wrapped up, local parents, small business owners, retired teachers, all asking the same thing in different ways. Who's really looking out for us? She was tired. Not just the kind of tired you feel in your legs after a long day, but the mental kind, where your voice feels one notch away from cracking. Her district was loud and chaotic, but Tulsa? Tulsa was quiet enough for her thoughts to catch up. She was wiping her hands with a napkin when Victor Bellamy approached her. A civil rights attorney with a deep network, Victor had worked with both parties, never really married to either. Older, gray at the temples, and always with a calm voice that somehow cut through any room. You keep swinging like that, you're going to need better armor, he said, nodding toward the building they'd just exited. Jasmine chuckled. Better armor? I need a backup throat. Victor reached into his pocket and handed her a phone. Not hers, his. The voicemail screen was open. What's this? Something you might want to save, he said. She raised an eyebrow. He hit play. It was Ivanka's voice, soft, sincere, familiar even. I know she makes people nervous, but Jasmine's the real deal. She's one of the only ones up there actually fighting for people. Jasmine listened without reacting. Victor watched her carefully. She left that message for Serena Evans. You know her. You both spoke on that education panel last year in Phoenix. Serena shared it with me because she thought you should hear it. And I thought, maybe you should hang on to it. Jasmine handed the phone back. Victor, I'm not in the business of stockpiling compliments, especially not from people who play both sides. Victor slipped the phone into her palm again. Just don't delete it yet. Not every fight's loud, Jasmine. Sometimes they creep in soft and sideways. You'll know when to use it. She didn't argue. 2 weeks later, she copied the voicemail onto her own phone. Not because she planned to use it, but because Victor was usually right. And deep down, she knew politics wasn't about the truth. It was about what people could prove in the moment they were being watched. Still, she told herself, I'm not going to use it. I'm not that kind of politician. But then came the slow shift. Panel members getting colder, conversations that used to feel open becoming guarded, people she worked with not returning her calls as fast, whispers about tone and optics. It didn't take long before Jasmine figured out that someone was laying groundwork. She expected a hit. She didn't expect it to come from Ivanka. That part stung. They weren't friends, not really, but there had been moments of civility. Respect, even. At a fundraiser in Dallas, Ivanka once asked Jasmine how she kept her fire going. Jasmine remembered answering, because if I don't burn, nothing moves. Ivanka had smiled at that. Now that same woman had used a government platform to try to paint her as unstable and dangerous. Not just political shade, character assassination. That was what pushed her to prep the voicemail. Amani had her doubts. Are you sure this won't look petty? Jasmine replied, if I scream, they'll say I'm angry. If I say nothing, they'll say I folded. This is neither. This is just her words, her voice, her truth. So they kept the clip ready, waiting. Not as a weapon, as a mirror. Now, watching the fallout spread across social media and through newsrooms, Jasmine understood what Victor had meant all along. The most dangerous fight wasn't the one where someone came at you swinging. It was the one where they smiled first. But as the news spread and public opinion shifted, people began asking questions that couldn't be contained inside any hearing room. The next morning, the headlines were everywhere. Ivanka Trump voicemail contradicts ethics hearing statement. Rep. Jasmine Crockett's calm clapback goes viral. Truth caught on tape. The story had outgrown the hearing. By 9:00 a.m., political talk shows were breaking down the audio frame by frame. Not just for what was said, but for how Jasmine had handled it. She hadn't shouted. She hadn't stormed out. She'd just held the room. Still, she wasn't celebrating. She sat in her office in D.C., hair tied back, a legal pad full of scribbles in her lap. On her desk sat a stack of documents, a mix of local housing proposals, mental health outreach plans, and an updated brief on the School Clean Water Act she'd been fighting to expand since January. Amani walked in, holding 2 coffees and a rolled-up printout. "You're trending again," she said, handing over the cup. "And someone at MSNBC called your response a masterclass in restraint. You want to post a thank you?" Jasmine shook her head. "I want to post my district's unemployment rate, but that won't get clicks." Amani chuckled but didn't push. Jasmine grabbed one of the folders from the stack. "You think they'll still call me unfit after I get this passed?" Amani raised an eyebrow. "Are we talking about the one with the funding for mental health clinics tied to after-school programs?" "That's the one." "I think they'll call you dangerous for making it look too easy." Jasmine cracked a grin. What most people still didn't know was how much work she'd already done, and how few people wanted to acknowledge it. In just over a year in office, she'd co-sponsored 12 bills, 7 of which made it out of committee. She'd pulled off joint town halls in Amarillo and Stockton with 2 Republican representatives who didn't even like being in the same room, much less on the same stage. She'd led the push to restore funding to a food access initiative in Southeast Arkansas that had been quietly gutted during an appropriations shuffle. When no one else would touch it, she made the case on the House floor, then followed it with local press to make sure her constituents knew who tried to pull their resources. It wasn't flashy. None of it made headlines, but it made a difference. Her methods weren't always easy to swallow. She didn't sugarcoat. She spoke plainly, and when needed, with heat. That made people nervous, especially those used to a more polished smile-through-your-teeth type of politics. But to the people she served, that fire wasn't just welcome, it was overdue. In East Fort Worth, where she held listening sessions at a laundromat every other Friday, folks didn't want polished. They wanted real. And Jasmine gave them real. Like the time a public health proposal stalled because of funding disputes, and she stayed in the Capitol building past midnight negotiating a compromise clause just to keep the mobile clinics running. Or the time she returned to Dallas 3 days after her father's funeral to meet with local organizers about rising eviction rates. Nobody made a headline out of that. Nobody replayed that on a morning show. But it mattered. And now, because of one voicemail and one moment in one hearing, people were paying attention, not just to the drama, but to the record behind it. That afternoon, a local outlet from Austin published a full feature on her legislative work, titling it, "Beyond the Headlines, What Rep. Jasmine Crockett Has Actually Done." It laid out her contributions line by line, complete with voting records, policy partners, and impact breakdowns by district. And people read it. Not everyone, of course, but enough to shift the conversation. For once, the story wasn't just about how she looked or how she sounded. It was about the substance behind the style. Amani tapped her screen. "You've got a radio hit in 10. They want you to talk about the voicemail." Jasmine leaned back in her chair. "I'll talk about the work," she said. "If they ask about the voicemail, I'll remind them it only mattered because folks wouldn't listen otherwise." Amani smiled. "You sure you don't want to gloat? Just a little?" Jasmine shook her head. "Nah, I'd rather they keep underestimating me. That's where I do my best work." But outside the walls of her office, others were starting to speak up, some publicly, some behind closed doors, and not all of them were her allies. The Capitol hallways were quiet by early evening, the echo of footsteps trailing behind staffers who were packing up for the day. The public frenzy hadn't died down, but the building itself was beginning to exhale. Jasmine had just wrapped a meeting with the Committee on Environmental Infrastructure. Nothing dramatic, just a check-in on the status of an inter-district green space project she'd pitched back in February. As she stepped out of the side elevator onto the second floor, she didn't expect to see Representative Robert Linton waiting outside her office. Tall, stiff, with a gray buzz cut and a tendency to end every sentence with a low grunt, Linton was known for his firm handshake and firmer disdain for anything not wrapped in traditional bipartisan lingo. He'd once told a reporter Jasmine had all the grace of a sledgehammer. Now he stood awkwardly, his thumbs hooked into the sides of his belt. "Congresswoman," he said, nodding stiffly as she approached. "Robert," she replied evenly. "Need something?" He cleared his throat. "I wanted to speak to you, privately, if that's all right." Jasmine studied him. "If it's something worth saying, it can be said in the hallway." A pause. He glanced down, then back up. "I didn't agree with what Ivanka did," he said. "Not that it matters now, I suppose, but I wanted you to hear that from me." Jasmine tilted her head, silent. Linton went on. "She tried to frame a narrative that didn't match the record. And whether I've disagreed with your methods or not, I can't say your record doesn't speak for itself." That made her blink. "I've worked on 3 bills with you," she said. "You barely looked me in the eye." "I had my biases," he admitted, "but I'm trying to fix that. I watched the hearing, and the way you handled yourself, well, that was hard to ignore." Amani stepped out of the office behind them, saw the two of them talking, and ducked back inside without interrupting. "You want something, Congressman?" Jasmine asked, voice calm but firm. Linton chuckled once, dry. "No, I just wanted to say thank you for reminding me why some of us are still here, and I mean really here, not just keeping a seat warm." She let that sit for a second. "Then I'll take that," she said, "even if it took a voicemail to get you there." He nodded. That it did. Then he turned and walked off, footsteps fading down the hallway like someone who knew they couldn't undo the past, but could try to walk forward a little better. A few minutes later, as Jasmine stepped into her office, another message came through. This one was from Representative Colleen Bay. She wasn't calling to apologize, at least not directly. Instead, her message was simple. "If you ever need support on that mental health funding bill, you've got it. Consider this my first real yes." Amani looked up from her screen, eyebrows raised. "That's 2 in one day. You expecting a parade next?" "Please don't jinx it," Jasmine said, settling into her seat. Just then, her desk phone rang. Line 2, press office. She picked it up. "Crockett." "Congresswoman, it's Angie from KCLB Radio," said the voice on the line. "I just wanted to say your segment earlier was fire. One of the clearest breakdowns of district-level impact we've ever had on air. The call-ins haven't stopped." "I appreciate that," Jasmine replied. "Also, just off record, one of our interns said her mom called and cried after listening to you explain why you fought so hard for those school water filters. Said no one's ever made her feel seen like that." Jasmine closed her eyes for a moment. "Tell her mom she was seen. That's the whole point." She hung up and leaned back in her chair. Not every win came with headlines. Some came quiet, carried in hallway confessions and unexpected voicemails. But those were the ones that mattered. They meant something changed, even if just a little. But that small shift was about to spread far beyond DC, because now the country was watching, and the media wasn't done talking. By nightfall, the clip wasn't just viral. It was unavoidable. Cable news had looped the voicemail alongside Jasmine's response like a political trailer. Talk shows debated Ivanka's motive. Analysts replayed the ethics hearing in slow motion, and even late-night comedians slipped Jasmine's line, "This isn't about image, it's about impact," into their monologues. But Jasmine wasn't watching any of it. She sat alone in her hotel room in Arlington, lights low, still in her blouse and slacks. The city buzzed outside, but up on the 11th floor, it felt distant. Her phone was face down on the coffee table, next to a bowl of room-service strawberries she hadn't touched. Amani had gone home hours ago after triple-checking that Jasmine's media schedule for the next day was locked in. Jasmine had declined 3 primetime interviews, 1 podcast, and a guest spot on a panel show. "Let the clip speak," she told her team. "People don't need me to explain it. They just need to sit with it." But the rest of the country was talking. In places far from Capitol Hill, cafes in Milwaukee, barbershops in Jackson, diners in Santa Fe, people were pulling out their phones and asking each other, "You hear what she said?" It wasn't just the voicemail that caught them. It was how calm she'd been, how she'd waited, how she'd let the truth do the work. Down in Alabama, an elementary school teacher named Carla Jenkins played the clip during her government studies lesson. "This is how you hold power without shouting," she told her 5th graders. In Portland, a young woman posted a video of her mom watching Jasmine's response on YouTube, tears running down her cheeks. "This lady reminds me of my auntie who raised me," the caption read. "They don't get credit till they force people to see them." Back in the hotel room, Jasmine finally reached for the remote and flipped on the TV. MSNBC. A panel of 3 pundits, all women, were talking about her. "She didn't just survive that attack," one said. "She flipped it." "Agreed," another chimed in. "She turned a smear into a spotlight, and now they're scrambling to catch up." Jasmine muted the volume. She walked over to the window, pulled the curtain aside slightly, and stared out across the city. The Capitol dome in the distance was lit against the night sky, cold and bright. Her phone vibrated. She glanced at the screen, her mother calling from Dallas. She answered on speaker. "Hey, Mama." Her mother didn't say hello. "That clip," she said instead. "I saw it. Your cousin sent it to me. Then your aunt called. Then my church group. Then some lady I barely talked to from bingo." Jasmine let out a tired chuckle. "Sounds like it made the rounds." Her mother's voice softened. "You looked calm, but I know that face. You were mad." "I wasn't mad," Jasmine said. "I was tired." "Well," her mother replied, "you turned tired into truth." They sat in silence for a moment. It wasn't awkward, just full. "I'm proud of you," her mother added. "I know," Jasmine said quietly. "Thank you." After they hung up, she stared at the city again. She didn't feel victorious. She didn't feel vindicated. She just felt awake. Because something had shifted. Not just in the room that day, not just online, but in how people were finally seeing her, really seeing her. She wasn't a caricature anymore, not just the loud one or the angry one. She was a person with work, receipts, and calm fire in her chest. And people were beginning to respect that. She turned off the TV, closed the curtain, and sat back down at the small desk, pulled out a notepad, scribbled down one word, momentum, then underlined it. Because this wasn't the end of something, it was the beginning. But what came next would test whether that momentum could actually lead to change, or just pass as another viral moment with no real follow-through. The following week felt like someone had lifted the floor under Jasmine's feet, and she was still deciding whether it meant flying or falling. Her inbox tripled in volume. Messages came from journalists, college professors, small business owners, and complete strangers. Some called her brave. Others just said thank you. The weirdest one was from a woman in Nebraska who admitted she'd never voted for a Democrat before but felt seen by Jasmine's calm. Jasmine forwarded that one to Amani with the note, "Weird day." Despite the flood, Jasmine kept showing up where it counted. She stood in front of her district's transportation board in Dallas the next Friday, arguing for sidewalk expansion funding like nobody in the room had ever heard of Twitter. Then she flew back to D.C. the same night and met with representatives from both parties about a housing pilot program for single mothers. At no point did she mention the voicemail. And that choice, not dragging it out, earned her even more respect. CNN did a Sunday piece calling her a case study in political poise. A local Dallas radio station replayed the clip every morning for a week straight. Even people who disagreed with her politics started saying things like, "Well, at least she owns her words." But the moment that stuck with her most wasn't any of that. It was a letter, typed, folded carefully, no return address, just her name on the envelope in shaky pen. Inside, a short note. "Ms. Crockett, I've watched Congress for 30 years. Usually I see a lot of noise. That hearing was the first time I saw someone stand on truth without trying to humiliate the other side. You didn't shame her. You just held her to her own words. I respect that. I taught debate at a small high school in Ohio for 18 years. That's what I'll play for my students next week. Not because of the politics, but because of the character. Keep going. HB." She read it twice, then again. No name, just initials. No fanfare, no social handle, no angle. Just quiet respect. Jasmine kept that letter tucked in the front flap of her binder. Because all the applause, the noise, the trending moments, those would fade. But this was different. It reminded her of why she got into this in the first place. Not for power, not for claps, but to make truth visible when people tried to bury it under polished language and convenient narratives. In her next speech at a university forum in San Antonio, she ended with a line she hadn't planned. "I don't care if people remember my name. I care if they remember how to hold power accountable without losing their own." It wasn't written down, it just came out. And the room went quiet. Not the stunned kind, but the kind that meant people were really thinking. That was the whole point. Not to win arguments, to plant seeds, to remind people that calm didn't mean weak and grace didn't mean silence, and that sometimes the most powerful clapback isn't a roar, it's a mirror. So when young women asked her, "How do you stay composed when they come for you like that?" she told them the truth. You don't stay composed, you prepare, so when the moment comes, your truth does the talking. And if they pressed further, she smiled and said, "Also, you keep good people close. People who remind you who you are before the world tries to tell you otherwise." Jasmine wasn't trying to become a political celebrity. She didn't want to be a brand. She wanted to be a page in a civics textbook 20 years from now under the header, Ethics in Action. So when the hearing faded from the news cycle, and when Ivanka stopped getting asked about it, and when people moved on to the next scandal, Jasmine kept working. Because the story wasn't about a voicemail. It was about what you do when someone tries to erase your value in real time. It was about standing still while the world tried to twist you into someone you weren't. And most of all, it was about showing people that receipts, done right, speak louder than revenge. If this story moved you, share it. Let people know that truth doesn't need to shout. It just needs to be heard. And if you're tired of politics being about games instead of people, subscribe. We've got more real stories coming.